this video, we will talk about painting clusters of small flowers like the apple tree blossom. I will be using a combination of watercolor and white gouache, and the trick would be to simplify the form, because of course we could paint every single flower separately, but my style preference is to eliminate a lot of details and just pick a few details to show our subject realistically, but not with photographic accuracy. So here's how I did it. I will start by painting the background with watercolors, wet on wet. I did not draw the flowers because really there is just too much to draw. I'm using the method of sight measuring to kind of project the image that I see onto my watercolor paper in front of me. And I'm following the photo pretty loosely. So if some flowers are slightly in a different spot, it really doesn't matter for my overall result. I basically see three main clusters of flowers. The lightest one is in the center, and there are two slightly darker ones on both sides in the upper right corner and upper left corner, and I see those very dark branches on the bottom, and the whole bottom portion I'm going to leave white. It's very important at this stage to leave some paper white, because that's what makes watercolor watercolor, is some white paper. So even though I'm using a big brush, I'm trying very hard to save some areas as white paper. I'm using quite a bit of pigment because I want to achieve a lot of contrast. My flowers are white or pale pink, and the branches and the leaves are very dark compared to those flowers. So to achieve that contrast, I will need a lot of watercolor layers, and I need them to be pretty saturated. So I need to have a lot of pigment on my brush. I think the trick with this kind of flowers, when they're clusters of very small flowers, is to know when to start working on the details. It's very tempting to start painting each flower separately, but I think the way to start would be to paint the background and to paint the overall forms of those clusters. And once that's in place and we have good tonal range, the things that need to be dark are dark on the sheet of paper on our painting, and the things that need to be light remain light. Then we can start working on details. Otherwise the painting will be fractured, all fall apart, it will be too many small things and they will not work together. So that's what I'm kind of trying to do now. I applied all those small brush strokes for the flowers, but now I feel I need to unify them. So I'm with a clean brush, I'm just kind of smudging them and unifying them all together. Okay, so this first stage was kind of figuring out my composition and drawing with the brush those apple tree branches, and now I think I got everything situated. In the center will be that light colored cluster, and the side clusters will be slightly darker, and the bottom will be white paper because I want to show the light that's coming through the branches, so I'm gonna leave it as white paper. Okay, now that I know where things are going to be, I'm going to mix some dark color. I'm using mineral violet mixed with cascade green, and I'm going to darken the branches. They're the darkest part of my painting, and I'm going to darken some of the leaves because I want to have contrast with the light pink and white flowers. The areas I'm painting over are still wet because I don't want a lot of hard edges right away. It's too early for hard edges, so I'm still working kind of wet on wet. And there are some very dark leaves here, so I'm going to paint those as well. And it's also important to vary the angle of your brush and to paint with the tip as well as with the side of the brush, because that gives you more variety of edges as well, and more variety of color, because your brush is not loaded very evenly, so you will get interesting color variations if you tilt your brush at different angles. So as you see, I'm starting to gain that contrast. Things are getting darker, and the light areas will hopefully become flowers soon. And I think the best way to show those dappled leaves where sunlight is coming through is to splatter some paint on paper and then spray it from your spray bottle a little bit. It gives your painting interesting texture, and it really conveys that effect of sunlight coming through the branches. Okay, I'll let my painting dry and I'm going to start working on those small flowers. I do need some detail, so again I'm going to add some small flowers with more intense pinks, and then we'll see how that turns out. It might be still a little too early for that, but you know, you will never know until you try, because this is not math, this is art, so all we can do is try something and see how it turns out. There is one cluster in front, that's the lightest one, and I see that cluster in the upper right corner is in the shadows, so I'm using some purple. It's ultramarine purple to kind of push it to the back. This detail work takes a bit of time. Even though we simplified a lot of things, we still have to paint some detail. I'm also gradually developing the edges of those clusters with those dark leaves that surround them. So it's a little bit of negative painting where I kind of define the lighter areas by painting around them with darker colors. And the secret here is not to define every single edge, but to find just a few that you can paint, and that will give the viewer the illusion that you painted a bunch of flowers. But really, you just painted them in a few select spots. Okay, the branches dried by now, and I see that they lightened quite a bit. You know, watercolor lightens at least two shades, so they need more pigment. I want them to be really dark. I obviously don't want to use black. I don't use black in my watercolors, so I'm using a mixture of mineral violet and cascade green. I also use cascade green for the leaves, so that unifies my painting as well. And I keep gradually darkening some areas of my painting to bring out the white flowers. Okay, now that my sketch is dry, I'm going to evaluate it, and I see that I lost a lot of white petals in the central lightest cluster and also in some other areas, so I'm going to restore them with a little bit of white gouache. I'm using artist gouache that has the same binder as watercolor, so they can be used in the same painting and they also can be mixed together, which I'm going to do in a little bit. I'm also going to use stippling technique. I'm using a piece of natural sponge, and I picked up some white gouache and I'm dabbing it on my painting, and I think it's really good to create again that dappled light coming through the leaves and the flowers, because it will be very hard to paint that very small texture with a brush, but using a sponge gives us like a little bit of the light coming through the flowers. So I'm going to apply it in a few areas. Important not to overdo it. Kind of stop every once in a while and evaluate the result. And another thing that I see and don't like is that cluster that's behind in the upper right corner. I used ultramarine violet and it graded out a little bit too much. So I want some pure pink color there, which I'm going to get if I mix my white gouache with opera pink watercolor. It will give me light, opaque color that can cover up those mistakes that I made in that cluster. And again, I'm not applying it absolutely everywhere. I'm working with what I already have on paper. I look at my painting and I'm trying to see what it needs, and I'm just making small adjustments here and there. Also here on the bottom, we can have a little lighter flowers. Some of the paint, when I painted the leaves and the branches, leaked into the flowers, so I'm going to restore lighter tone there with my body color, mix of white gouache with watercolor pigment. Those flowers have little like pink specks on them, so I'm going to add the texture with some splattering with watercolor. And this last section of painting will be just balancing all the colors, adding small details that I eliminated at the previous stage, but I think now it's time to add them. So just getting everything where it needs to be. And I think overall my painting looks too cool, in the sense that the colors are all pretty cool. Even that pink, it's on the cool side. So I think what I'm going to do is add a little bit of yellow to the background to imitate the sunlight. So I'm going to use lemon yellow and just give my background a very, very light wash with lemon yellow. And maybe a little yellow on the leaves because they look way too cool, and if they're in sunlight they will have a lot warmer glow than what I have in the painting. So again, a few brush strokes on the background to make it even darker than it is. Alright, and I think our painting is done. Here is Apple Blossom painted with gouache and watercolor. I hope you found this video useful, and let me know in comments what are your favorite flowers, so maybe I can paint them and post a demo of the painting. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video here on TammyRupp Studios channel or on my website tammyrupp.com, where you can find information about my live and recorded classes.